Thank you so much for joining us on the Patros Podcast, a ministry of Man Up. Our website, patros.us, is a great resource and place where you have free access to things like videos, other resources, as well as podcasts, where you get to just be challenged as a man to lead with purpose, grow in faith, and disciple the fatherless generation.
Yeah, and we've created this resource with you men in mind and you church leader in mind, because we know our churches need resources that equip men to go out and not only be the man that God has called you to be, but then do something about it. See, we want our orthodoxy or our right thinking to match our orthopraxy, our right doing. We can't just have one without the other. And so this resource is going to get your men to do just that.
So go ahead to patros.us and we'll see you there.
This is the counter kingdom. So it's the kingdom turned upside down. And so when you try to go get your life, you lose it. But when you lose your life, you gain it.
All things were made for him, through him, and unto him. To know him, you are so great and so holy, and I recognize that I am nothing but dirt, but yet you have chosen me. You have chosen us.
He's not calling for surface level relationships. He's calling for something much deeper.
This weekend here, the experience that God gave us was just so much more powerful.
So this week we're going to be talking about the theme from the 5th session of the Counter Kingdom series, contrast over conformity. We'll be diving into Matthew 5. And so, Jeff, I don't know if you want to take us through the verses or...
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about this one. This is our Patros study, Counter Kingdom, and hopefully you guys are enjoying the videos that are available to you online. And if not, this is your first time stumbling along, and you're like, man, I was just trying to I was Googling how could I live in contrast to the world, I want to be faithful, and you landed on this podcast. Man, we're so glad to hear this series is for you, because it's all about the counter kingdom. How do we live in a culture and world that is completely foreign to what we want as believers?
Yeah.
I remember Pastor Kyle in one of the videos talked about why does it seem have you ever wondered why it just feels like you're living like an out-of-body experience? I don't know what he said, but it's you just something doesn't feel right. He's because you were made for another world.
That's good.
C.S. Lewis said that. He said, when nothing in this life can satisfy your ultimate desires, right? No matter how hard you try, nothing that you try ultimately oh man, I mean, that was good, but it's still...
There's something missing.
There's something missing. He's like, if nothing in this world can do that, it means that you were made for another world. That's such a good line.
Yeah.
Because he's right. It's this is not big, oh, science, this. Bro, just take 2 seconds to think about it. If you're really honest with yourself, this world does not satisfy.
Yeah.
It brings fun, it brings pleasure, good times, but man,
it always goes away.
And you are constantly, I don't know about you, you let me see. You're constantly living for the next high, the next weekend, the next paycheck, the next vacation,
and you're
the newest
constantly
car.
getting let down.
And you have it, and you're happy for what?
A moment.
Yeah. And anybody's ever gone on a vacation, you go on it, and as it's coming to an end, you're not even left the cruise ship yet. And you're like, oh, this sucks. I'm so depressed. You're still out on the ocean, bro.
Yeah. Well, there's something to and maybe I just struggle with this, or a few of us do, but sometimes it's all the fun of the expectation and then all the fun of the memories. But
you can't even live.
The actual thing is sometimes it is very fun. You're laughing your face off and X, Y, and Z. But then those moments end.
They always end. And then so you're left with only the memory.
Yeah.
So you could do something when you're 25 and it was a day in time or a week in time and it was amazing.
It didn't satisfy.
It didn't satisfy. So you have to live on the memory of it.
Yeah.
And the memory is more important than the actual event, because if you live till 75, that was 50 years you had thinking about the memory of it. Oh, so awesome. Remember when we did? And the actual thing sucked. Or it was it was all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just...
it just points to how, regardless of how fun or how pleasure-filled any moment or day is, it all pales in comparison to the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah, it just does. And so I would challenge any atheist, honestly. I love me some atheists and some agnostics. Have I shared with you, I used to debate these guys? Do you know this story?
I know that you used to debate.
Yeah, so for the people out there, when I got saved in 2005, radical, I got saved out of being unfaithful to my wife, and that's the point in my life when I knew I was a sinner. I've been growing up in the church, but I really didn't think I was that bad. And this pointed out my sin to me. And when I lost everything is when I realized how he was everything. And I turned to him. I was radically transformed. I mean, I remember weeping over my sin for literally like years. In fact, I would even today, I would question if you haven't ever wept over your sin, if you really, know the gravity of it,
Yeah.
But anyway, so coming out of that, I just was so on fire for Jesus, and I realized, wow, this stuff is defendable. I can actually, because I read the scriptures for the first time, and I always thought you couldn't defend the scriptures, so I didn't read them.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait a second. I started reading them, delving in. I'm like, oh, there's a reason. There's not contradictions here. So anyway, I
things that were seemingly contradictory were
once I
actually
looked into
complementing
it,
each other.
Yeah, I was like, oh, hold up. Any honest person would say, oh, I can see both sides to this. Yeah, I can see why you would say it was a contradiction, but I also can see why it's not.
Yeah.
Right? Because if I'm being honest with myself, given the context, I can see why, And so, anyway, I remember, this won't surprise you, I would write into the paper. So this is before social media, right?
They're like the newspaper?
Yeah.
Oh.
Tampa Times.
I was into a paper.
No, Tampa Times. They
way.
would do an article, and there was this girl, there was a columnist. I remember her name. Robin Blumner is her name. Raging, bleeding heart liberal. Love you guys. And I would disagree, so I don't even know what it was about. I wrote in disagreeing, right? The next week, some guy writes in, because they published my thing. It was in the paper. And someone wrote in on my comments. So they were commenting on my comments on the article.
Reddit before Reddit.
It was Reddit before Reddit.
That's crazy.
It was like a thread. So I was like, yo, who is this dude? His name was Mark Brandt. Shout out, Mark.
You even remember the name.
Oh, no. Because I was because he became a friend. I would consider Mark a friend now.
No way.
So I see who he is, and I'm like, man, who is this dude?
Yeah.
I'm like, I need to figure him out. So I figured out where he lived. I got an address. I sent him a letter, and I said, hey, you commented on my comment. I'd love to discuss this more. He replies via email. This starts a friendship. And he's an atheist,
no
right?
Way.
And we're going back and forth, and da-da-da-da-da. He's really smart, really thoughtful guy. His big argument was always if God is real, why can't he just tell us all the same thing? Why does he make us guess?
Why play the game?
Why play the game, Jeff?
Yeah,
why can't just he appear to us all at the same time? So
that's Alex O'Connor's thing too.
Yeah.
I've tried for years. I've even lived with Christians. I've done everything I can. I've read the entire Bible, and he still hasn't revealed himself to me. Why?
Yeah. And I get that. It was honest. So very honest guy in that regard, I thought. And so we struck up a friendship. So then I was going to Calvary at the time, and I was going to men's groups and stuff. And I said, hey, listen, I told Mark, I said, why don't we organize a debate or a discussion? And I'm like, would you guys come to the Baptist church, He's like, oh yeah, I think we can get there, So he came, and it was 4 or 5 of his guys, 4 or 5 guys, Christians. And literally we had people around in the audience, just listening, to this debate between Christians and non-Christians. And so this just continued on to the point where when we adopted, my first donation, when we're hey, we're trying to raise money to adopt, or was from Mark, the atheist.
Wow.
And he goes, and I remember the note. He said, you probably think that I'm giving you this donation so that you will think I, an atheist, am a good man. And he's like, well, you're right. Which I just thought was awesome. So I totally bunny trailed there, but that's to say, I love discussing these things with people who don't believe like I believe.
Yeah.
And I do think even if you are an atheist or an agnostic, if you're honest with yourself, you have to look at the meaning of life and purpose and all of that and go, what really is it all for? And why am I never satisfied? I mean, Mick Jagger said it best, right? Can't get no satisfaction. If the rock star understood it, and you see so many people have fame and fortune, and are they happy?
No.
Are they whole? Are they fulfilled? Do they have meaning? And that's why you hear guys like Russell Brand, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Guys like Jim Carrey.
I mean, there's
come to
so
faith,
many
like,
coming.
There's people coming to faith because they're like, I was empty. Deion Sanders, like, I was empty in all of this.
They've acquired all the wealth, all the fame, literally anything that you can ask for.
Correct.
And they're still just, there's nothing.
Right. And so the counter kingdom message says, like, hey, this conformity that you have in your culture where you think you need to be doing, like, all of these things and it's going to bring you happiness, where, you know, you need to get good grades in school, you need to go get a 4-year degree, you need to make sure that you have the best education, you need to have the highest job, you need to live on that house on the hill, and, you know, white picket fence, all that stuff is somehow been perpetuated over the years. And I'd be interested to know, like, for your generation, what it is. Like, for my generation, I just described it, right? It was like, go to school, get a good job, raise your family, you know, have your, you know, 2-car garage, your single family home, your little plot of land, and, like, everything will be perfect for you. You have your white picket fence and your 2.3 kids, and, like, that's living, right?
Yeah.
And then you realize, oh, life is hard. Sin gets in the way. I'm super selfish. I want to tear down the white fence. You know, kids, you know, are terrible, and I don't get along with my wife. And, like, it's all hard, right?
Yeah.
So, like, what is it for your generation or the younger generation even? Like, what are they?
Like, what's the goal?
Yeah,
like
what is life supposed to be? What's that like?
I think it's two
What's the culture
things.
telling them?
There's different things, right? Because I mean, you've seen this because now you live in somewhat that community because you guys have chickens. But it's one of them, and it's like holistic.
Yeah.
It's a good thing. It's like build your family, get some chicken coops, maybe get some land, and have a job that gives you the ability to do that. Maybe homeschool your kids. And you know what I'm saying? Like, that's one of them.
Oh, like, I was ahead of the trend.
Yeah, you guys got – but that's like a big thing right now.
Yeah.
And I would say the other one would be the opposite of that, which is don't have kids because I can't imagine bringing kids into such a broken world. The world is so bad right now. But really it's like, no, we have dual income, no kids. That's why there's a name for it. It's called DINK, dual income, no kids. Yeah, you're a DINK.
You're DINK.
Yeah. So you guys travel and
make your money, go
experience the world. Maybe you donate to some places, which is good. But, like, you have all the money in the world because you don't have to spend it on kids anymore, you know? And you just focus on you. You go out, have amazing dinners, and hang out with your friends all the time. So I'd say that those are probably the two that I'd say are, like, the ones that people aim for. Where it's
funny,
like,
too, like, super competing ideas of the world.
Yeah.
Right? Like, those are two opposite kind of things.
Yeah. But I think that both of those are, like, what people kind of just do.
I think, and part of that is just because of the digital age we live in, your generation has had, and younger, have had more information than has ever existed in any time.
Yeah.
Like, we grew up and we didn't know what you guys know.
No.
We didn't have access to it.
We talk all the time, and I'll be like, did you hear this? Did you hear this?
I'm like, no.
And you're like, yeah.
I'm like, no. Although, like, what did I say in the last podcast? And you're like, oh, no, Big Brother.
Yeah. I was like, what's Big Brother? But, like, we've talked about this. We don't only just have access to, like, our peers' lifestyles, because that's one thing. You see your friends that just bought a house, like, and that's a big thing for us because it's so hard to buy a house right now for my age, right?
Especially in this area.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the economy in general, hyperinflation's on the way, like, all that stuff. But we're also in an age where we have access to the experts. For the first time, you're listening to experts disagree in real time.
Yeah.
And
offer a competing view.
Yeah. Like, for the first time ever, you have truly, like, intimate access to these people that back in the day, like, you'd have to go through the media outlets and they're editing it to
you'd have to read a paper or an article like I did in 2000 and whatever when I was writing into the
Except
Tampa
now
Bay
you
Times.
have, like, the expert, then you have the sub-experts that can also compete with them. They're just not as famous.
Yeah.
So, like, we have too much access to information for us to just have one
kind of
model of the American dream.
Yeah. And I don't know if it was one, but,
I feel like that's all I heard growing up. It was like the white picket fence.
White
thing. That
picket
was a big
fence and
phrase.
2.3 kids.
Yeah.
And yeah, like the whole thing. My wife and I talk about it all the time.
And y'all got 2 kids.
We had chickens. And we homeschooled for a while, and you know. But we talk all the time about that, like life did not turn out that way for us. So whatever that ideal was, it did not turn out that way. And you know, when we look at Jesus and this idea of contrast over conformity, like I think I very much conformed. Like I very much try to conform to the world. In fact, like when I graduated from college, what you did was you got married. I went to a Christian college, Wheaton College, shout out.
Like that was normal to get married that fast?
You got
after college? Almost
everybody I knew got married within a year of being out of college. Almost everybody I knew.
That's crazy.
So this was like very normal in the culture so it's a Christian subculture.
That's probably also the thing too.
Right? So it was a Christian subculture, but you know, there was a reason they talked about getting your MRS degree.
Yeah,
you know,
because people were out there.
They're out there looking,
scoping,
right?
Yeah.
And so, okay, well, that's the next thing. Here I was dating, you know, Liza, and money was never never was something that I was really attracted to. Like I always wanted to make a difference in the world. The money part was not the thing. And, but I remember when I got there, I'm like, well, shoot, if I'm going to get married, I got to buy a ring.
I need money.
Yeah. So I took a job where I had to wear a suit and tie. I had a 20-minute drive to the train station, an hour into downtown Chicago, another 20 minutes to my job. And then I'm walking around the loop in Chicago in a suit in the middle of summer. I mean, I was miserable. I was utterly miserable. And then I had to catch the train and go back and da-da-da. It was the exact opposite of what I wanted, but I succumbed to the culture and the view of so I didn't have any contrast at that time. I think at that time in my life, I wasn't saved. I wasn't a believer.
Yeah.
But even like in my own flesh, I wasn't, I don't know. And the irony is like I'm an Enneagram 8, so like I push against the culture a lot. Like I really resonate with Jesus challenging the Pharisees. But for that piece of it, for marriage and stuff, I'm like, no, this is what you do, you know.
Well, and at this time in your like journey, are you, because for let's say a 22-year-old believer, like I had a call from one of the guys in college that just asked me for some relationship advice last night. Like he just called and was, because that's what I tell everybody that I've discipled, you have access, just call me and we'll talk. But if you're not saved, and maybe you're also not looking for advice all the time, like were you calling or talking to disciplers about like, hey, this is what I'm thinking, and maybe them being able to be like, hey, you know, have you thought about this, or have you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Were you there, or was it like you're kind of just flying by the seat of your pants? Bro,
flying by the seat of my pants. I think one of the things I respect about today's youth, and you know, it's funny, I was talking to a gal yesterday who's helping me with some things, and she was like, hey, what is inspiring to you right now? And I had 2 answers. I had a personal, professional. I mean, the personal was my wife, and just like watching her start to flourish in her mid-40s is really amazing. But I said, these Ohio State guys that are part of this Counter Kingdom, I am blown away by just how mature they are and how forsaking the culture. Like they're living this contrast over conformity. I see them, and it's one thing to say, you know, when you're outside looking in, like, wow, that's amazing. It's another thing to be in it and have what the world is calling to you at your fingertips, money and whatever comes with that, all the trappings, the fame, the riches, the houses, the cars,
the ego,
the women, whatever it is that is going to be that thing that you could have. And they're like to the point where they don't even want to tell anybody that they're like a football player.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, man, I wanted everybody to know.
College football.
Like you know, I benched this. You know, what an idiot I was, right? Like I cared so much about what people thought about me, and these guys. So I'm really inspired by them,
which is a testament to the Holy Spirit changing,
and it's God working. But I think what I've appreciated about that generation is that they are more open to being like vulnerable and asking for advice. So when I grew up, we were still in this transition to where we're at now, where you were still a little bit of John Wayning it, right? Like I can pull myself up by my bootstraps.
That's the culture.
Right. I'm not going to admit weakness. I'm not going to, show, we talked about dependency and autonomy as one of the previous lessons that we covered in this Counter Kingdom. I'm not going to be dependent upon anybody. I'm independent. Like I'm autonomous, and if I have a problem, I need to handle it myself. And
that's crazy. So
you guys don't do that.
I know that was like I think a lot of people still do, but the culture has shifted. Yeah. Like where it's
but being on Instagram,
it's foolish to think that way almost.
That's what I'm saying. Like you guys have all this access to information. So for you, it's like, well, of course I'm going to go ask somebody. I have it at my fingertips. Back then, you didn't know who to ask. And so you start asking around, you kind of look like a nut job. Like, why are you asking for help all the time?
Because even
Get your stuff
that
together.
generation before you was like, you're not supposed to ask that. You're supposed to go figure it out.
Or like, it was just kind of this unspoken thing that.
Like, why are we having an intimate conversation? Even?
Why are we having an intimate conversation?
Wow.
Yeah, like intimacy. And the younger you get in generations, I think the greater capacity for intimacy based on the culture.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about like contrast over conformity, one of the things the culture has done that I think is positive is drive us to a more intimate way of looking at things and viewing things.
Like emotionally vulnerable conversations. Yeah.
So I think it can work both ways, and it works both ways in our hearts. So if we look at this passage in Matthew, Matthew 5, it's 21 through 48 if you're following along at home. And in this, Jesus has a whole bunch of, you have heard it said, but I say to you, right? So he says, you've heard it said, don't murder, but I say to you, whoever's angry is already murdered, essentially, right? You have heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I'm telling you that anyone who looks at woman with lust has already done it. He goes on to talk about divorce. He goes on to talk about making vows, or like kind of like signing contracts almost, like what you do there. He goes on about how you treat your enemies. So he talks about all these things, and his message is, you have heard it said this. This is the conformity. This is the way that the Jewish leaders live. This is how it's been passed down from generation to generation. But I say unto you. And what's so ironic about this is Patros, this whole podcast is about embracing like a healthy view of masculinity. What does it mean to be a healthy man? And then passing that on. Yeah. So there's nothing inherently wrong about passing it on. In fact, we would argue that it's a good thing. Yeah. Right? Like that's what we're trying to solve fatherlessness, is by passing on this wisdom to a fatherless generation so that they can raise their kids with something that they didn't have. And hopefully that they don't do the same thing, right? That they hang around for their families. And yet here Jesus is saying, like, you've heard it said all this, but I'm telling you something else. So ultimately it's about truth. And where are we getting our truth messages, right? Where are we receiving that? So my question to you is, what is the most influential force today? Where are, who and what is influencing the most people? And the follow-up question to that we can discuss is, where are we getting our moral compass as a culture? And then that's conformity. What does contrast look to? Because I would assume that not all of that is biblical. Like if we believe the Bible, we know that there's a devil who's the king of this age. I mean, he's in charge of the zeitgeist, the current spirit of the age. And Jesus offers us this counter kingdom. So I'm going to assume they're different. Maybe they're not. But.
Yeah. I think it's social media and podcasts. I think that's why it's equally as dangerous. It's equally dangerous and beneficial, because it's dangerous in the fact that it's what is it, like back in the day there was like the First Amendment, right? Like you should be able to say whatever you want to say anywhere. But there was also like a common place to speak, right? So whoever was speaking at the what like I don't know how to explain it, but like it's not the marketplace.
Like at a town square?
Town square, yeah. But typically who speaks at the town square, it's like you have authority or you have there's a reason.
The mayor or
there's a reason people are listening to you. Whereas social media and podcasts, it's fair game.
Any old person.
For anybody.
Like us.
Yeah. Now that's good in the sense of you can hear so many different diverse opinions. There's I think that's helpful. But I think it's equally as dangerous because you can have somebody influence people to some really bizarre stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's one of those things that, but yeah, I'd say that that's where a lot of people are forming their opinions and morals and their compass is social media. And that's why, I mean, I think the CIA says that like media is a weapon. I think there's been some stuff on, there's conspiracy theories out there about other countries wanting to influence our social media platforms so that they can like break down the family systems. And so like if you know how to completely infiltrate a culture, and that's through podcasts and that's through media, like I'd say that that's the most powerful way that people are influencing their own truth, their version of truth.
Well, yeah, and you hear that often here, like, this is my truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what they mean by that, I get what they mean by that, right?
This is what I believe.
This is what I believe.
Yeah.
Like, essentially what they're saying. This is my truth. This is what I believe. And so I don't take that away from anybody. You have a belief, right? But the language is so crazy because when you say my truth, you're essentially saying like it's an oxymoron. You're pitting two competing ideas against each other.
Because you're then saying that your truth isn't necessarily true.
Well, like my is saying this is an opinion, right? Like I'm saying it's mine. I'm not saying it's yours. I'm not saying yours. We have different opinions. But
I'm just trying to keep the place peaceful.
Or even
Yeah.
not. But the point is like this is mine,
Yeah.
and then I'm going to match mine, which is an opinion and arbitrary, against. Maybe not arbitrary, that's probably the wrong word, but it's mine, right? Individualistic
Yeah.
versus truth, which is something that's for everybody.
Yeah.
If something is true, it's true for you and it's true for me. It's
But
true.
if it's mine, then you can't hold it accountable just because it's mine.
Correct.
Yeah.
So it's brilliant language, and I would say by the enemy,
Yeah.
to be able to come up with a phrase that it's hard to argue against and disagree with because you're just like, well, who are you to argue against my truth?
Yeah.
It's a hard one to come against, right? Because
Yeah.
you sound kind of like a jerk if if I explain why that's an oxymoron, that you can't actually put those two together because either it's your opinion or it's a truth. But for you to say it's your truth, all you're saying is you have a belief on that. Well,
Yeah.
so does everyone else. So it's not.
Yeah,
it doesn't
like
make
you can
it
believe
true.
wrongly, but that doesn't make it your truth. It makes it you believing wrongly.
It just makes you believing in a wrong
Which
thing.
you can find fine. You could do that.
And fine, that's fine. But let's call it the right thing. You're
Yeah,
believing in
yeah,
something
yeah.
that's wrong.
Yeah.
But to have that, there's so much nuance in that. You already bored people with it. Like they're not. They got 15 seconds for your answer, and if you didn't convince them, and let's be honest, like some of the more, I would say, complex ideas take time to just
Unpack.
sift through and unpack. Yeah. And we don't really have time for that. I do think that's one of the dangers of our culture today is that we're really simple. So even though we have so much information, we're really simple about it. And I think there's a reason because we're overwhelmed by the amount of information. And so it's like, man, I got all these ideas out there. I don't know who to believe, and so I'm just gonna boil it down to a soundbite and not dive into, because otherwise I'll get overwhelmed. I'm not gonna know what to believe. So I kind of get that.
And to
as
your
well.
point about the generation having so much access to so many voices, is what you do is you kind of pick and choose. You're like, I kind of like some of this Christianity stuff. I don't like that the God is like a monotheistic God that doesn't like these things. So I'm going to take some universalism and I'm going to put it here. So we're all saved. And then I kind of like the idea of energy and us all being God. So maybe we're all God, and then you just pick and choose and put it together.
And animistically make your own religion, which is really just your religion.
Yes,
like
it's your truth.
It's your truth, right? And
Yeah.
but you've taken it from sources of truth traditionally and convinced yourself that this is actually how it is. And if you're not willing to critically think about it and evaluate it, and that's why I do appreciate our atheist friends and our agnostic friends.
Yeah.
Because if anybody is thinking critically about it, they are.
Yeah.
And I hate the idea that we would just take something at face value and believe it. And so in many ways, this idea of contrast over conformity, our atheist friends are doing that, right? Like they're going, listen, I'm not going to conform just because,
I'd say it would depend on, maybe it's the more intellectual atheist versus there are people that claim atheism And when you go into conversation with them, you quickly understand that they just haven't thought through it.
They just haven't. And I would agree.
Same thing with Christians.
The intellectual atheists, are the ones that I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
But see, then it's ironic when you get into science.
Yeah.
Because in science, and again, here's why we have to be so careful with language. Because they have crafted a narrative, and I'm going to say the academic atheists who are scientists. I'm talking to you. Mm-hmm. You guys have crafted a narrative that you never lose. It's a heads I win, tails you lose all the time. Yeah. Because what you've done is say, look at all of this evidence. We know this is true. Right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's science. Mm-hmm. Right, dummy? It's science. We know this is true.
Yeah.
And at the same time, when that is disproved in the future, we go, oh, isn't science so wonderful? It's open to like scientific inquiry, and that's why it can change over time. Yeah. But right now, this is true. So you can't believe anything else other than this.
Yeah.
And you're going to get canceled if you bring a different, like, challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
You challenge the whole conformity. And you know this with the science projects that you've been working on. There are so many professors who are afraid to come out in support of ID, right? Because they don't want to be canceled.
They'll get killed on the academic
crushed,
realm.
And they will lose even if they don't have tenure, but they'll lose.
Yeah, some of them have to wait till their tenure to even come out and speak.
Yes.
And so they'll have to be quiet, and some of them literally just don't talk at all because they just I know of one scientist that he's tenured, he's incredible, so people don't challenge him directly, but they'll spread lies about him. They'll spread rumors on the internet about him because and here's the thing, and they'll say that he's Christian, he's putting Christianity. All of his published articles don't mention God.
Nothing.
Not one of them. The only time they mention God is when he says, "I hope that you do notice that I did not put God in any of this."
See, you put God in it.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right. Like so yeah, there is a narrative that has been created to basically lose for Christians.
Yeah. So I mean, language matters. And we're getting these ideas, to your point, I think, from social media. We look at influencers. I mean, it's funny because when my wife and I had the blog back in the days, I mean, she was an influencer before they were called influencers. So we didn't have – so Facebook, I think, was like 2006 maybe it came out, 2005, 6. That was kind of the first big one. There were other ones, but that was like kind of mainstream. And so we had that channel. And at the time, I would have never – guessed like where it was going to go and where it is now. Yeah. And then, I mean, you probably don't even remember this. Facebook was huge. There was nothing else. I mean, it was like
I remember
social media.
Like that was like everybody was talking to each other on Facebook.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that was it. And then now you have TikTok and Instagram, which have it's a
fast-paced content consumption. It's not necessarily networking.
No, it just
the same way. Yeah.
So my wife never made kind of that shift to like the quote unquote like real influencer, but she had influence over. I mean, we had 500,000 people coming to our site every day.
You guys were probably influencing where people were shopping.
What's that?
Like, were you guys even influencing where people were shopping just because of the coupons?
For sure. Like we absolutely told people what to buy, and then they went and bought it. You know.
Wow.
But we were showing them the deals. I mean, it's not like it was something that they didn't want.
It wasn't like, oh, this is my affiliate link. It was like, no, this will help you if you guys buy this, this, and this.
Correct.
Yeah.
So like sometimes you'll buy something that you don't actually want the most because it's such a good deal.
Yeah,
you see what I'm saying? Yeah. Like I'd rather have this truck, but I'm gonna get this truck because man, it's like 30% a third of the price.
Yeah.
So you'll do that, and that's kind of what we did, but. We were influencers of the culture in that regard. And now, though, it is totally different. I mean, it has really changed. And so I do think that we're getting most of our ideas, from that entity. What I would like to know, though, is like motivation. So if we were to ask people why they do the things that they do, right? What's the answer? What has culture taught us, like conformed us to think about that this is how we respond, like and like so easy. But if I would ask you, well, why do you believe that? Like, what are people saying?
Yeah, I think there's different answers. to your, like, to what you said, like, when I was working on the science project that I've worked on, like, a lot of the answers that I got when it came to where do we come from, you had three. You had people that discuss how they were raised at home.
Mm-hmm.
You had people that discussed what they were taught in school. And then you had people that said, I just don't think. Like, I'm not thinking deeply about stuff. I'm just trying to just live. So you had those three, where it was, you know, what has my family taught me to be true, and I just follow that. And that was across the board, whether they were atheist or Christian. It was just, like, you didn't often run into people that were like, I have critically thought through all of this, I've done research, and therefore I changed my position. Typically what I was running into was, I'm just either following what my family taught me to follow, or I'm rebelling against it. I'm following or rebelling against the school system, or I'm just living life.
So it's so crazy, right? The people that haven't taken time to think. And I wonder if we place ourselves back in, like, Jesus' time, and you just had life, just like we do today. And people were born into a culture, and the Pharisees were in charge of the quote-unquote church, you know, like the synagogue or the temple or whatever. And then there were these, like, kind of celebrities, rich people who somehow were Jewish but were, like, cozied up to Rome, you know, and they were kind of the real power brokers. And, like, that, so you listen to those two people or you get in trouble, and I'm going to pay my 40% or 50% of my money is going to go straight to the Romans. And you just kind of grow up in that. And, you know, you just naturally conform.
Yeah.
Right? And so how do we...
Well, and they grew up in a time where everything that was... I mean, you look at the Catholics with the Latin Bible, where all you knew about God was through the priests.
You didn't have a Bible.
And there was no way to check them.
Yeah.
There was no way to contrast, because you had no content to contrast with.
Yeah.
Or for the
except
Jews,
except your conscience.
Except your conscience.
And
but
I
how
guess,
do you fight? They're saying, I have the word of God that I can read. You can't even read.
You can't even read.
What are you fighting me with?
Yeah.
Like, I have a feeling. Well, the Bible here says your heart is deceitfully wicked above all else. So give me your money.
Give me your money and sit down, or we'll burn you at the stake.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's where you go, well, yeah, if they're burning people at the stake, though, does that seem to be consistent with, you know, and I think those are some of the questions that our atheist friends ask, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, you know, if God is really this, then how could people in his name do this? Or how could God, you know, do these things? So I understand all of that.
So then what's the utility of contrast over culture?
Yeah, being contrasting. Yeah. Well, I think for us as believers, like, where this, like, the rubber hits the road is in the thinking. And we, you know, I've shared this a lot in our staff meetings, where I'm like, hey, you know, kind of the 80-20 rule, 80% of the stuff you do is probably things that are not pushing the ball forward. Like, you're not helping us end fatherlessness 80% of the time. And me too. Like, we're not. It's because we're doing. It's counterintuitive to think, I need to spend most of my time thinking, strategizing, planning, because if I do that stuff, I may be able to think of something that is taking up 50% of my time, that if I just spend 3 hours in really careful thought and then execution on it, I'm now spending 0% on that because I figured out a way to accomplish it before. It was just this headache, and I was constantly engaging in it, trying to, you know. And so I'm always, you know, this trying to encourage the team to think.
Yeah.
So that is where the conformity piece, I think, hurts us, is when we're not willing to think and we just are accepting what our authoritarians tell us.
Kind of like that. What was that Elon story that you said? I think you shared it from the book or something.
Yeah.
What is it? He talks about, like,
Oh yeah. I think I know what you're talking about, because he had this process of these surges,
like,
right?
why do we do this or something?
And so he would go through the factory, and to each station, he'd go, why you're using 4 screws here? Why can't we use 2? And they're like, well, the safety something, da, da, da. He's like, well, have we tried 2 screws? He's like, well, no. We tried 2 screws. He's like, yeah, but the board of safety says that we have, I don't care what they say. And so they would do it, and then they would test it. And then if it would break, they go, hey, we need 4 screws. Be like, okay, let's go back to 4 screws.
Yeah. But to have a reason for something, not to just do things just because that's what people do.
Just do it because that's what people do.
Yeah.
And that's what they were doing at this time. They were following, and Jesus comes on the scene in a radical way and says, you have heard it said we're going to use 4 screws. And I'm telling you, like, 3 is better.
Yeah.
That's a bad analogy, but
it's your analogy.
It's my truth. It's my truth and my analogy. Leave me alone. I was trying to make a connection to Elon, and I was like, I started talking about screws, and I'm like, this is not going where I want it to go. Oh, man, we just lost everybody. They're like, these guys really are idiots.
But no, yeah. So
but
Jesus
you get
is
the
literally
idea.
coming on the scene. You have all these people that have given all this authority to the people that are running the culture for centuries. This isn't like longer than America's even existed. They have these traditions. You have this guy coming on the scene that's not a political figure. He's
nobody.
And he's like, I'm saying
it's this way.
Yeah.
That's a radical notion. It's just a
Yeah.
radical notion. It's hard to even think about what that would be, but it would be, I think, similar to, someone coming in to a church and going, listen, you're here, your pastor? Like, no, that's actually not it. It's this over here. And then so as the people, you're going, well, which one do I listen to? How do I know? And that's where really one important principle is, you remember this in Acts, I think it's Acts 17:11. And it was that the Bereans were more noble, right? Than it was the Thessalonians. I'm not sure. I can't remember who it was, but the Bereans were willing to go and check the scriptures to make sure that what was being preached was actually true.
In line with ultimate truth.
Correct. And so that's where, when we just listen to the culture, when we just listen to Joe Rogan, when we just listen to Elon Musk, whoever that influencer is, but we're not willing to check it out for the Word of God ourselves, and I will say this, if you're just listening to your pastor, you are being disobedient. Yeah. Straight up, you're missing the boat. And that's not to demean the pastor. If your pastor is a biblical, faithful man, he will say,
no,
go check it out.
Yeah.
Check me. Yeah, exactly.
Like, put me next to the scriptures, and if anything I say doesn't line up, like I know a guy that he's a pastor, and he had he didn't miss the mark on like the actual sermon. He wasn't preaching heresy, but somebody had asked him like, hey, why didn't you bring this up when you were preaching? And he was like, I didn't think I needed to. Changed his sermon. Because the person that sent him some ideas of like, hey, no, I think that this actually is necessary because of these scriptures here. So you have the boldness of a church member to say, no, I'm willing to let the pastor know, hey, not in a demeaning way, just theologically, I think that this is helpful. And for the pastor to have the humility to say, you know what, I appreciate that.
That's really good. So like, as we wrap this question, right? Practical ways to keep influences in check. So like, how do we, as men living in this counter kingdom and wanting to not just conform to the culture absent-mindedly, right? How do we make sure that we are living in contrast to this culture? I mean, some of the things the culture says to do, I think are probably in line because it's God's truth. Like wherever truth is, but how do we practically make sure that we're checking the influences that are in our lives?
I think you have contrast, not for the sake of contrast alone, but for the sake of it's the willingness to stick to the Word of God. Yeah. And so whether that's your friends around you, all any influence that you have in your life, if at all you ever are looking around and saying like, I look at that before I look at the scriptures, then that's where I think you always, like to your point, what you were saying with the Bereans, you always go back to the scriptures. If it doesn't line with the scriptures, then it's not good enough for me. Yeah,
totally agree. Like when I consider this question, I think who you hang with matters. You know, so I would evaluate your friends, evaluate the people you spend the most time with. Are they bringing you closer or further away from Jesus? Yeah, if they're bringing you closer to Jesus, man, stay with it. But if they're taking you further away, you need to evaluate those relationships. Yeah, and to your point about the scriptures, That's it, man. Like
Yeah.
the truth,
Yeah.
not my truth or your truth, is found in the scriptures. And so I think there's some good things that the culture has to say, but any good thing the culture has to say is because there is common grace on that person, right?
Yeah, there's a parallel to probably the scriptures. There
Correct.
that you could
Whatever
find.
that principle is, and you see this all the time, and like this
Yeah.
principle and this, they say it all, and you're like, man, bro, that's in Proverbs, right?
Yeah, that's been around for 3,000 years.
Don't try to jack Solomon's stuff. So anyway, I think, men, we just need to look at the
accountability.
culture, and say, is that something that aligns? And do I have a good friend that can tell me? Do I have a good friend that can put me in my place?
Yeah.
Like, do I have people that are not yes men around me? Because if you're kind of powerful, you got money, the culture says don't check them because, and Jesus is saying, no, those are the people that need to be checked.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so
you should want to have, and even elders, like, have you gone to your elders and said, like, hey, hold me accountable.
Yeah.
I submit to your authority in my church.
Yep.
Are you even going to church, or are you somebody that
There you
doesn't?
go.
Yeah, like, there's so many ways for you to fight against the culture influencing you versus the scriptures.
Yeah, that's right.
So thank you guys for joining us on this episode of the Patros Podcast, and we'll see y'all next time.